get to say, okay, God, how are you wanting to bless me through this experience? How are you wanting to bless others, right? And that perspective that says, this is not happening to me, it's happening for me. And so what is the good that God wants to bring? What's his redemptive story for me? And then also for the people I lead from this point forward.
Hi, friends, and welcome to Lessons from Living. I'm really glad you're with us today because we have a topic that will help so many people. A couple of months ago, I was just impressed by the number of people that I continued to hear from about being mistreated as an employee. And it made me really angry and frustrated that we're not talking more about this in society and figuring out ways to avoid it and how we can learn to be better leaders. And as so often happens, God put this young woman in my path who knows all about this. She's a psychologist. This is her specialty. She's just so adept at being able to articulate it, what it is, and how we can navigate this process of trauma that occurs under people in authority. So I'm just really excited. If you have ever experienced mistreatment from an employer, if you have a friend who's going through this now, this is well worth a listen. I would share it with friends and family. And again, I am just so grateful to be able to introduce to you today Dr. April Minatrea. Welcome, April. I'm so excited to have you on Lessons from Living.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Let's start with you tell us about your background and why you went into this field.
The short version, I'm a psychologist. I have years of experience in private practice, did that brick and mortar for about a decade, and had really come up through the veterans system, VA system with my internship and my postdoc, and was drawn to that. I think always had an interest in psychology. And from the time I was a child, I wrote my first psychology paper when I was 8. And then the Lord really called me to this profession, gave me Isaiah 61, which talks about binding up the brokenhearted and setting the captives free. And so that was how I knew that psychology was for me. And so I embarked on this journey of private practice and serving veterans outside the VA. And so spent about 10 years in private practice working with veterans and other folks from every, different walk of life. But that was kind of my wheelhouse, was combat trauma. And then that led me to eventually the place that I'm at now, talking about leadership injuries as well.
Okay, beautiful. Okay. Well, I'm so excited to have your expertise today because I'd really like to drill down into this leadership trauma concept. So could you define it for us?
Sure. I define leadership injury simply as the negative interactions, or the negative effects of interactions with leaders or authority. And I talk a little bit in terms of critical leadership injuries, or CLI for short. And that kind of acknowledges the fact that, like, hey, somebody might step on your toes, but you're not critically injured, right? It's one of those things that you can just kind of brush it off and, like, okay, that wasn't my favorite thing that ever happened in my life, but I'm not, in any way traumatized or permanently affected by that. Versus when we think about a critical injury, even in a medical context, right? A critical injury is something that, like, wow, that's more serious, and it's something that maybe has lasting effects. And that's what we see with critical leadership injuries. It may be something that happened in your past, but it's still affecting your present performance, right? It's something that's influencing your mindset, how you're seeing the world, how you're showing up, how you're seeing yourself, could be affecting your confidence, something like that, and causing you to play the game differently than if you had not been injured.
Hmm. Okay. And would you consider it to be more pronounced than other forms of trauma?
I would say leadership injury on the whole, I would say, is probably really, really common. Almost everyone's been hurt by a leader at some point in their lives. And so if we talk about, the first leaders we have are our parents. So some kind of leadership injury or childhood wound, if you would, that shapes us in some way. And that
Hmm.
can be a one-time thing. With any of these, it can be a one-time thing or it can be a pattern of things, a series of things. We go from our parents or caregivers to teachers. That comes to include coaches. That also includes pastors and that includes bosses. I have yet to talk to anyone that I can think of offhand that has never been hurt by anyone in any of those categories and
Right.
or has never been hurt um, in their role as a leader. Because by the way, it goes both ways. It can
Hmm.
be some, we talk about it most of the time. I'm working with people who are in terms of recovering from leadership injuries. We may be recovering from something that happened from somebody above you, a leader or superior that did or said something that that was harmful. However, it's important to acknowledge it goes both ways. There are leaders who are hurt by the people that they're leading. That it operates both ways. And the other thing I'll just interject here in terms of how broad it is, it can also be something that happens on like an organizational or institutional level where there's some kind of negative impact because of an authority. It wasn't necessarily a particular person, but it was kind of the system or the organization. And that has a lasting negative effect sometimes. So with that broad of a definition, almost everybody has experienced this at some level in their lives.
Right. And can you give an example of how a micro trauma can happen when a person is young and how it has the potential to affect them as an adult?
Sure, sure. I would say probably one of the most common things is, maybe a comment that's made from an authority figure, could be a parent. I can think of one case where I was talking to somebody, it was their teacher said something and they made a decision, right? We make these powerful decisions even as children. I'm never gonna do that again, or I will always do such and such. And so in this case, it was the child decided I'm never going to speak up in front of authority again. Well, fast forward, now you're in your 20s, you're in the workplace, you're in the room with your boss and your team or whatever and you have something important to contribute to the conversation, but you've made a powerful decision. I am never going to speak up in front of authority because I don't want to get shot down like I did from my teacher. And so now you're holding back and your team's not getting the best of you. You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in terms of promotion because you're not bringing your best to the team because of a decision that was made a long time ago
Hmm.
and that you might not even necessarily be consciously aware of. But that would be an example of something, it feels relatively minor like, "Oh my goodness, it was just this one little comment from a teacher." And yet we don't measure it by like how severe the incident was. It's really about how serious was the lasting impact of that and what was the cost of that impact over time.
Okay. So it sounds like the cost of the impact is very individual, then, individual to the
Yes,
person, how they internalize it, how they deal with it. You
very
said
much.
that these are very common. Is it is it common to see a series of micro traumas or injuries over specific singular events then, if it's that common?
I would say there are different patterns that you see. Sometimes it's a one-time event,
Mhm.
sometimes it's a series of small things, and sometimes it's a combination either way. So for example, you might have something I can think of somebody that there were a series of things where they were being overlooked or things weren't being addressed or what have you. And then that resulted in a big blow up kind of experience, right? And then you'll also have the reverse pattern where it might be, oh my goodness, somebody just got blasted. And then after that, it was like, oh my goodness, this is super awkward. Now I feel unsure of myself. Oh, the relationship just feels kind of icky. And so then that leads to more miscommunications, more misunderstandings, more hurt feelings, and other, skewed ideas about relationships, about authority, about oneself, about one's role, all of those kinds of things that can affect performance. So it can go either way.
Okay. And in terms of leadership injury as being caused by employers, what is the trend line that you're seeing? I feel like anecdotally I'm seeing a pronounced uptick. But is that reality or am I imagining things?
I I think there's a lot of it out there, and I think it happens in 3 ways, right? I think you have what we in today's culture would call toxic leadership, right? There are people, and this is hurt people, right? So chances are they've had some difficult experiences themselves that they haven't worked through or healed from, and the old saying goes like, if you don't heal, you'll bleed on people who never cut you. And so these are, those toxic leaders are people that have not yet gotten free perhaps of the things that they've experienced. And so they're perpetuating a leadership style that can be downright mean, can be downright dismissive, very control oriented, lots of different patterns that you'll see. But there's a segment where there's truly toxic leadership that is creating a lot of these issues. There's also an acknowledgement like, hey, there's some really good leaders out there. Even a good leader can have a bad moment, right? None of us are perfect. And so I might 99% of the time be a really good leader who really believes in and shows up for my people. And then there might be a time where I'm just having a bad day, or this one particular issue is touching a sensitive, it's a hot spot for me, and I fumble in how I handle it with my team and I create an injury there. Right. For whatever reason, that particular situation, I dropped the ball and I created injury. The third thing that happens is that sometimes we have perceived leadership injuries, right? It's not that the leader has done anything wrong. And yet, the person on the receiving end perceived being wronged, perceived an injustice, or interpreted those events in a way that was harmful for them, in a way that did damage either their self confidence, their faith in leadership, their ability to trust, whatever the case may be. And I'll say it this way, I've seen this happen in my life. I know other people I think have experienced this where, one of the natures of hierarchical things is that sometimes people at the top have more information. Oftentimes they have more experience and more perspective. And so there have been times where when I was in this position, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. Or I can't believe they
Right.
didn't do that. Right. And then as I grew in my career, I was like, oh, you know what? I think I get it now. Oh, you know what? They actually made the right call. Right. Oh, I probably would have done the same thing in their position. Right. And so part of it is like I perceived it, but it was because I didn't yet have the perspective, or I didn't yet have all the facts or all of the information or the understanding that the leader had when they made that decision that I was, affected by. And then over time I was, oh, yeah, that was really perceived. It wasn't that they were at fault in any way. If that does that
Okay.
does that clarify what you're asking?
Yes, it definitely does. I was thinking, I was kind of breaking employers down into a couple different types. And one of them was someone who's causing injury, but doesn't even know that they're doing it, which I wouldn't really say that's, I guess it would be toxic leadership, but ignorant toxic
Right, right, right.
leadership. And then
Sure.
there are people doing it probably who know they're doing it and don't care to change. Now, that's very toxic.
I would venture to guess that there's more of it happening out of ignorance than malice.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily know the hard numbers on that. I don't know that we have research data yet, of how many people say, "Yes, I deliberately
Uh-huh. Right.
I'm just deliberately difficult as a leader, and I just try to make it hard on people." And I don't know how many people acknowledge that and say, "And I really just don't care." Um,
Right.
there
Right.
are people who would say, "Yeah, no, this is my style and you can take it or leave it, and if you don't like it, you can go to another organization." And by the way, that's
Mhm.
what people do.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
that's oftentimes what happens. Sometimes it happens with their awareness, but without their intent, right? That's the thing where, and by the way, I mean, there are plenty of parents who have experienced, this regret of like, oh my goodness, I totally lost it with my kids today. And that's not who I aspire to be. I didn't like how I showed up in that moment. So I'm aware of it, but it wasn't intentional.
Right.
I don't delight in watching other people suffer or making their lives miserable.
Right. And then for the good people that you're talking about, and I would include my husband in this group, who, as a small business owner, really desires to create a positive culture, but they're faced with significant time constraints. And probably don't even know how to use the time they do have to work toward creating that culture. So, if we're looking at these different types of leaders, this is difficult to.
A lot of opportunity for positive change.
Yes, yes. But I'm wondering how, as individuals, we can act to be better, and maybe even societally, how we can encourage improvement across different leader styles.
I think as individuals, there's two sides to the equation. One is for us to do our own work and to walk through recovering from the leadership injuries that we've experienced. And and again, the more that you've recovered from your own, the less likely you are to perpetuate those knowingly or unknowingly, right? We create around us what's going on inside of us. So if that's something that's continuing to replay because it's unresolved, then it's very likely that we're going to repeat the mistakes that the wrongs that have happened to us. It's just more likely to happen. So that's one thing that we can do. And then we're kind of like free and clear, and we're not bringing that old baggage, so to speak, into our new interactions with the people that we're leading. And I think going through that process also makes us more aware of other people's experience of us. It just helps us with our empathy and our ability to see, like, how am I being perceived here? We're just more aware of it if we've been through thinking through our own injuries. Then that kind of bridges us to thinking about, okay, how am I showing up as a leader? How are people experiencing me? What am I actively doing to build into my people, to believe in them, to bolster their belief in themselves in a way that actually protects them from feeling injured or having their confidence rocked? Even if there's a conflict or I give some feedback that, hey, I'd like to do things differently, or that wasn't quite what I was looking for here, or I'm going to need you to make this change. But so this is one of the things that we talk about. My father and I collaborate in in the leadership space. He talks about an exponential mindset. And one of the things that is part of that mindset is being able to separate who we are from what we do. And I think there's such a tendency, and again, so now this gets into some of the cultural things that are happening as well. There's such a tendency in our culture to confuse our performance with our identity, and to derive our sense of value from what we do rather than who we are. And so the more that we affirm who people are, then the more that we create this sense of protective buffer. That, like, by the way, so if you're really secure in who you are, then somebody can critique your performance or your work product. And that's not a commentary on whether or not you're good or bad as a person, whether or not you're worthy, et cetera, right? People who have a high degree of that security and identity and self-worth can actually welcome that feedback, because they're like, oh, you believe in me and you believe that I can do better, right? I remember talking to one guy, he was like, oh, confrontation is my love language. Right. And for those of us who are people pleasers and are like, oh my goodness, please don't do that. I think it was really interesting because he was like, that was his take on it. He was like, but if you're giving me that kind of feedback, that tells me that you believe in me and you believe I'm capable of more than what I've already shown you. Right. And that comes from that self image that is solid, secure, and healthy, so that the performance being critiqued doesn't interfere, right? And so we want to start bolstering those kinds of beliefs and building into our people to make that possible.
I'm seeing a parallel between what you just said with adults and children, parenting, separating out behavior from
Hmm.
who they are.
Hmm.
So that's interesting. It's kind of the same idea.
It is, and it's interesting because I think we've seen now in the research with children, when parents affirm kids for, hey, good job, for their performance, and sometimes even traits, but traits that are performance related. Oh, you're so smart.
Mm.
Then fast forward, you give the kid a task that they're not very good at. The ones who have been affirmed for a trait such as, wow, you're a really hard worker. wow, you really persevered. You kept going even when it was tough, right? Kind of this message of like, you can do hard things. Those are the kids that will persist when a task is difficult and they'll actually be more successful. The kids who have been praised for their performance or praised for being smart are actually less likely to persevere because it's like, wait a minute, hey, I've got the smart streak going. I don't want to put myself in any position. I don't want to work on anything that I don't think I'm going to be good at. I don't want to do anything I'm going to fail at. I don't want to be exposed as stupid. So I'm not really going to try here. Right. And so even the praise that we give to children, we want to be praising those qualities that are going to help them be able to persevere and qualities about the kind of person, the nature of their character more so than their accomplishments. That doesn't mean you can't celebrate accomplishments, but we want to be focused on character more so than accomplishments.
Talk us through the process of a trauma situation. You've said that the end game can translate into an opportunity for what you call redemptive leadership. Can you just kind of talk us through the process?
Taking the work that I've done with veterans, I've adapted the process of healing from invisible injuries on the battlefield to recovering from other types of invisible injuries and kind of condensed it a little bit. And the first part that's common to both is simply recognizing the impact of what's happened to you. Right? It's really hard to address something that you're not even acknowledging. And so being able to say like, wow, okay, yeah, that did impact me. That did hurt. That was a loss. Like that was not my favorite thing that happened. That was hard. And I think it's affected me, right? Just acknowledging the injury. It's very hard to, thinking about a sports injury, right? It's very hard to treat an injury that you are not acknowledging exists. I'm
Right.
fine, rub some dirt on it, that kind of thing. Like, "Ooh, you're probably not gonna, yeah. If it's not one of those minor things that, there are certain things, again, hey, somebody stepped on my toes, that's probably gonna spontaneously correct. If they've stomped on my toe and crushed a bone, that's probably not gonna, you might need to have that looked at.
Right.
So that's the first part is just recognizing the impact. The second one is receiving validation and receiving empathy and comfort, right? There's something on an emotional level that we need to have our pain seen and taken seriously, to have somebody say, "Hey, that should never have happened to you. Hey, that was wrong. Hey, that was an injustice." Right? There's something about it being acknowledged, and particularly when that acknowledgement, comes from someone else that's like, "Okay, I get it. Okay. Okay, I've been heard." And when that happens, it's kind of the opposite of gaslighting, right? So let's think about what happened, when you're like, I'm trying to tell somebody my story and they're telling me I'm crazy, that didn't really happen, or it was all my fault, or the things that you hear sometimes in those situations, right? The pain perpetuates. And when we're not feeling heard, often we escalate until we feel acknowledged and heard. So being able to receive that comfort is part of the healing process. And I think of it back to the analogy of a physical injury. Think of that as the pain management part of the process.
Okay.
Then the next thing we want to do is release the negativity, right? And so especially when we've received compassion from someone else, and there are different ways that can happen. But when we've received that compassion and that empathy, now we become better able to release negativity. We become better able to release compassion towards those who have hurt us. We become better able to release compassion toward ourselves for whatever role we might have played in things. And it becomes easier to forgive. It becomes easier to let go of things, right? And we realize, wait a minute, until I do that, if I'm replaying and nursing and rehearsing over
Mhm.
and over and over again, I'm actually reliving the bad experience every single time I tell this story. I'm continuing to do that. And until I'm willing to let it go and release it, I'm going to keep living in that pain. And the only way to stop that cycle is to stop that story. And that's a really powerful moment to be able to say, "Hey, actually I'm giving that person real estate inside me. to keep hurting me in here. They're not even thinking about it. They're not suffering just because I'm mad or just because I'm hurt or they are going about their, their day and going on their merry way and they're not actually suffering at all for that. I'm the one who's suffering as long as I continue to replay it. And so when we come to that of like, oh, by the way, and I have the ability to choose to let go of that. I don't have to hold on to it anymore. That's a decision that I have the power to make independent of whether they're sorry, whether or not they say they're sorry, whether or not they're even alive. Like they don't have to be
Mhm.
in my life. They don't have to be on board. I can make that decision for myself. And so that's actually a way of us taking our power back by releasing the negative things we've been holding on to. And then the next step, the fourth thing that we do is we want to re-examine those powerful decisions. What were the things that while I was in pain, I made a decision. This is like Scarlett O'Hara, right? As God is my witness, I will never be hungry again, right? I will never speak up in a meeting again. Whatever those powerful decisions are, and it might be an always, it might be a never, it might be a should or a must, or, but those kinds of things, or all leaders are dot, 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 dot. Or, people in authority is dot, 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 dot. You can kind of fill in the blanks. Re examine those. Is that still serving you well? Right? And this is part of undoing the actual damage. Because if it was like, hey, I had a mindset that was this, and then it kind of got bent when I got bent out of shape. My way of thinking, was skewed by this painful experience. And I changed how I was approaching things to protect myself, very natural instinct, and sometimes even temporarily adaptive. But then fast forward, is that still serving me well? And if not, then I can change it. And I could say, you know what, that was probably just that one instance, or maybe it was just that one person, or maybe that's true, but only under these circumstances. So if I'm not in that circumstance, I don't need to, I don't need to use that playbook if I'm not in that situation. And then finally we come to the place that is redeeming your story. And so saying, okay, well, so this bad thing happened. And where do I want the story to go from here? And that's where we have that opportunity for post traumatic growth to say, okay, how did this make me better and stronger? How did this cause me to think differently? How has this shaped me as a leader of others to be able to give maybe something to them that I didn't get but needed? Right. And so if I become a better leader to all of the people under me because of that one bad experience, right, there's net gain there, not just for me, but for all of us.
Mhm. That's powerful. Going back to that point at which you are making a bad decision, potentially, that could affect the way that you see things from here on out. Is there a way to recognize what is going on in that moment? Is it a decision that is often irrational or just so big and misguided that looking at it clearly, you kind of go, this doesn't make sense? Or do you not see it until after the fact?
I would say the majority of the time we don't catch it in the moment, especially when we're children. We're not yet aware enough for that to happen, right? And so
Mhm.
it's subtle um, enough that it just kind of slips in there without us necessarily knowing or having tools. As we grow, I think there is the ability to detect, hey, wait a minute. It feels like something shifted. It doesn't feel like that's a life-giving, way of
Right.
thinking. Hey, the more that we feed our minds on things that are healthy, on things that are going to promote growth, the quicker we are to sniff out things that are like, wait a minute, it feels like I'm actually going to be limiting my life. Wait, and we start to learn anytime that we have that, I will never, like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Yes.
Anytime it has that kind of frequency on it, you got to like be, that might be a knee jerk reaction. It might be an overreaction. It might look differently if I kind of let all of the chemicals in my brain calm down. Let's reevaluate this in a few days when we've had a chance to breathe and work through it. And this is, again, it's a knee jerk reaction from a place of pain.
Right.
And when we're in that place of pain, we often don't have our rational brain on our A game. Right? It's
Right.
it's often straight emotion. and we do it without thinking. And so I think that's the thing of recognizing, oh, wait a minute, that actually that has the quality, the flavor, or the frequent it's on the same frequency as those knee jerk reactions, and it's destructive, and it doesn't really fit with the whole picture of who I want to be.
Right. Okay. Well, while we're still on the subject of processing the trauma, you've made a comment that Christians tend to jump to forgiveness instead of dealing with trauma. I would think, I would hope that Christians are very well positioned to handle these situations because typically they care deeply about people.
Mhm.
What is a way that we can encourage the best characteristics of a Christian while ensuring that they walk through the process in a healthy kind of way?
I love that question. And I think one piece of it is acknowledging why we jump to forgiveness. We are so afraid of being in unforgiveness that we're like, no, 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 I can't. I know I can't, I can't be in unforgiveness. Oh, I can't let the sun set, on my anger. Oh, I got to get there. I got to get, oh my goodness. This one came in at 4 p.m. and it's going to be dark at 5. I better hurry, and it's like, well,
Right.
I just got to make myself get there real fast. And the problem with that is that we're kind of foreclosing on the process and we don't really know what it is that we're forgiving, right? If I
Mhm.
if I came to you and I said, Beth, I hate to have to tell you this, but I took some money out of your account. Will you forgive me? Do you want to know how much it was first? You may say, "Hey, I know that I'm a Christian. I know that because God forgives me, I'm going to forgive it, whatever it was." And yet to really fully complete that process, it would probably be helpful to know, was it $10 or was it 10,000? How much was
Right.
it? And so to be able to just reframe even seeing those first couple of steps, the recognizing the impact and the receiving validation, that is kind of assessing the losses. That is, if it helps you to say, hey, that's the precursor. It's part of the forgiveness process is to know what I'm forgiving. And I can set my heart's intent that I'm going to forgive this person. I already know I'm not going to stay in unforgiveness. And yet, in order to say, yeah, I'm willing to write that off, I kind of need to assess, well, what's the damage? What does that cost me? And and that's so if you see it as part of the process, I think it becomes easier to do that. And then the other thing that we have as an advantage as Christians is to say, I have the one who has perfect love living inside me. I've given my life to the one who had the ability while being crucified to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Like God is the best forgiver. He is the master forgiver of all time. And so we have the power of the Holy Spirit to then engage us to be able to do that forgiveness step, to be able to say, and by the way, when I'm re-examining my powerful decisions, I mean, so he's going to be with you at every step of the process, right? He's going to be the comforter who's going to help you with receiving that validation. He's going to be the one who's going to help you with releasing the negativity and being able to forgive, right? And when we recognize what he's forgiven us of, and we're like, yeah, I probably should let that go. I probably shouldn't hold something against someone else when God has forgiven me of so much more. So he gives us his grace and power and perspective to do that. He can give us love for our enemies, right? If he commands us to love our enemies, he's going to give us the power to do that. He's not going to ask us to do something he's not going to give us the grace to do. And then when we're re-examining those powerful decisions, really what we're doing is saying, is the way that I'm thinking about this in line with truth? And if I have developed a limiting belief, if I'm believing some kind of lie from the enemy, the enemy's given me his interpretation of events, and he's done that to put me in a box, then I want to know the truth. And the truth is going to set me free. And so now I start to say, my powerful decisions need to line up with the way that God thinks, right? And so now there's hope there. And that brings us to the redeeming of the story, right? God's going to make all things work together for good for those who love him. And so we get to say, okay, God, how are you wanting to bless me through this experience? How are you wanting to bless others, right? And that perspective that says this is not happening to me, it's happening for me. And so, what is the good that God wants to bring? What's his redemptive story for me? And then also for the people I lead from this point forward. So he's at every step of the process. Great.
That is beautiful. When I was talking to my husband about this, the forgiveness issue, he said, I am not that good of a person. He said, I get stuck in anger. He said,
Mm,
I'd get to I'd talk to the person who took the 10 or $10,000 and, and sit
right.
there a while, and be angry about it before I'm able to take all these additional steps. So I thought that was funny.
That's and yet it's really, really true. And
Hmm.
this is the reason that I encourage, especially those of us who are Christians and know we're supposed to forgive.
Hmm.
I really encourage people to say, "Hey, has that wrong or that hurt that you've suffered been acknowledged and been validated that it shouldn't have been that way?" Because what happens if we skip that step and we try to go to the forgiving, and we're like, "Well, I've chosen with my will to forgive, but my emotions are still all over the place." And so how many times have we had things, right? This used to happen to me when I was younger where I was like, "But I already forgave that, but now it still hurts and it's still a problem. I haven't been able to get over it." It's because my heart wasn't healed because I didn't receive comfort. I didn't receive acknowledgement of like that was an injustice, that was not okay, right? And there's something about that step of the validation that says, "That was wrong of them to steal from you." They
Right.
should never have done that. That was not okay. That was an injustice, right? And just
Right.
when you hear that and you're like, somebody is going to bat for you and is advocating for you,
Hmm.
then it's really powerful to be able to say, yeah, okay, well, now that you're taking up the anger on my behalf, I'm like,
Right.
yeah, okay. I don't feel like I have to keep repeating the anger in order to be heard. It's
Right.
like, okay, that's been acknowledged. Yes, it's been heard. Yeah, it wasn't supposed to be that way. And that's part of the comforting and healing process. And now, okay, now that we all agree that was not a good thing to have happen, I don't want to stay there. I don't want to keep living it. So how am I going to do that? You know? And then being able to release that because it's just going to keep me stuck if I hold on to it. So I'm
Right.
doing it. I'm not even doing it for them, by the way. And
Hmm.
I can give you an example. So I had something happen years and years and years ago. I had paid a photographer and we had, prepaid for our package and all of that and did not get the photos. We got to look at the proofs and we chose them and we were supposed to get photos and we did delay a while in terms of, coming back with all of that. But I think what happened, I think he spent the money and
Ooh.
didn't deliver the photos. And so I went about calling this man. This was years and years and years ago. I went about calling this man every single day to bother him. I was like, I'm going to be the persistent widow. I'm going to just be there and I'm going to just wear him down, right? And at some point, I mean, this went on for months. And I finally realized, okay, first of all, he's probably blocked my number. He's probably not getting my daily voicemail. It says, "Where are my photos?" And so it's probably costing him nothing. And it's costing me every single day that I relive this. I take time out of my day to try to dial this
Mhm.
number and try to get justice for myself. And every time I think about it, I get mad and angsty and upset all over again. And so finally, I came to the place that I said, "Oh, I just have to let this go." Right. And now I have a wonderful story that I can share with all of you. I have been free. I've just let it go. I don't need those photos. It no longer matters. Right. We've all gone on with our lives. I've been living happily without them for 10, 15 plus years. And now I have a great illustration of the power and
Mhm.
freedom that we get of forgiveness.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
In thinking about this from an employee's standpoint, I see a potential for employers to be held accountable by an employee who's willing to say, let me make you aware of this situation. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior. This is specifically what has to change, and I will find an employer who will treat me well
Hmm.
if it doesn't change. What I'm wondering is, particularly with younger employees who don't have the interpersonal skills to be able to have a productive conflict with their employer, Is that why we get to quiet quitting, the great resignation? I'm curious if I'm assessing this right. If you could go into what quiet quitting is and whether you see this as a point where the whole leadership injury issue could be headed off, but for a lack of interpersonal skills by many employees.
I think that's definitely a huge contributing factor. And there's two pieces of it. I think one is that I don't know how to bring this up. It's just uncomfortable and I don't know how to do that. And so I'm just not gonna. I've already made a decision, right? That I'm they're not treating me the best, so I'm not going to give them my best and I'll just show up and do the bare minimum and collect my paycheck and quietly go home, right? Then there's also the, hey, even if I know how to have this conversation, I don't think it's going to do any good. I don't think I'm going to be listened to. I don't think I don't think my voice matters and I don't think they're going to change anything, right? Again, these are powerful decisions. They may or may not be true. It might be true, it might not be true, right? And so I think either I don't know how or I don't think it's going to be effective if I do. The combination of those leads to, and yet I can't really afford to go somewhere else, especially if you've adopted the belief, by the way, it's going to be this way anywhere, right? There are no better options. So you just got to resign yourself that this is how life is and what have you. That can be a part of it, but it doesn't have to be, right? I think this is where leaders have an opportunity to create a culture that says, hey, let's have a conversation. Hey, is there anything in my leadership style that is challenging for you to accept or that's been harming? You flat out can ask the question. Is there anything, that I've done as a leader that's been harmful to you? Or is there anything that's happening in the culture of the organization that has been? You can also flip it around and say, if you could make one change in the culture of our organization, what would you like to see different? Right. So now you're framing it in terms of like, what would you like to see different? What's a positive? And then from what they offer, you may have the opportunity to say, And so are you not experiencing it that way right now? What are you experiencing? And just having that dialogue, it may be uncomfortable for employees to bring that up. They may be afraid of retribution. They may be afraid of, either in the moment of like, okay, well, if I do this, I'm going to get slammed,
Right.
or oh no, they'll play by the rules in that meeting, but then I'll be blackballed, right? And I'm not going to get picked for those projects, or I'm not going to get promoted, or whatever. It's going to create. People are afraid of the consequences sometimes. And so for the leader to say, hey, let's just put it on the table. Like we want to have, this is the dynamic we want to create. This is the culture we want to create. What are, how are you experiencing that? Are you experiencing anything that's not congruent with that? Anything that's contrary to that?
Mm, those are such good questions. You're describing a very enlightened leader, I think. One on the
That's what
far
we're here
end of
for,
the
Beth.
spectrum.
We want more of them in the world.
I know. So I'm thinking someone like that who really wants the best for their employees, are completely invested in their success, wants them to be able to use all of their gifts and abilities and really thrive in their role. Is there a way to encourage that kind of leader? And the other types of leaders we've talked about, encourage them to aspire to that kind of leadership. I'm just thinking, I would like to get beyond just treating people well, because to me, that's a baseline,
Mhm.
How do we inspire people to want others to grow and be the best they can be?
For me, it's come from reflecting on the leaders that did that for me. And so
Mhm.
when I have this conversation with others, if I'm, in a keynote or a workshop or something like that, oftentimes one of the ways that I'll interact with the audience is to say, let's take a moment and let's think about the great leaders that you've experienced. And even as people are listening now, like hopefully like somebody's face is popping in your mind, right? It's easy to have the toxic leadership conversation and to have somebody's face pop in your mind. But even as you're listening now, like, who's encouraged you? Who's inspired you? Who believed in you? Maybe even when you didn't believe in yourself? Who went above and beyond for you? And who are the leaders in your life that maybe even caused you to say, you know what, that's somebody that I would go above and beyond for? What were the
Mm,
qualities that those people had? What did they do? How did they treat you? What difference has it made in your life? Right. And so think about your heroes, you know, and oftentimes, people talk about, maybe it was a parent, maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a boss, something like that, but somebody along the way who believed in you and treated you well. And when we realize what's been given to us, then I think we're more inclined to want to give it away. I think back to your other, question about how is this particularly played out for Christians? I think there's an inspiration there as well. And to say, like, so really what we're talking about in being that kind of leader, we have an opportunity to represent the heart of God to someone. And I love Lou Engel's notion that each of us is a dream wrapped in flesh. God's dream wrapped in flesh. And so when
mm,
I start to see each of the people on my team as God's dream wrapped in flesh, then now, out of my love for him, I want to draw out his dream and help his dream come true. And that causes me to want to invest in my people, right? And because I see that, oh, I actually have, as the authority figure, I actually have the opportunity to represent Papa God's heart to the people that
mhm,
he's given me to steward.
mm. That's good, April. This is going to feel like whiplash after what we discussed. But I just wonder if, in focusing so much on trauma and dealing with trauma, have we as a people become too soft? It seems like everyone is in therapy for something. We have a whole generation referred to as snowflakes. you know, Kids whose parents have really not done them a service by overprotecting them from tribulation, which
Mhm,
inevitably they're going to face later in life.
mhm,
Many people would say adversity makes one stronger, I think.
mhm,
And particularly as a Christian, I believe that God designed us to be strengthened by challenge,
mhm,
and so that when we're going through that process, we learn to depend on Him
mhm,
for His strength and hope for us and becoming the best person we can be, oftentimes because of the adversities we face. What
mhm.
would you say about all that?
I I think you're spot on, right? Even that little shift that we talked about earlier of, like, to be able to say, "Hey, wait, this is not happening to me, it's happening for me."
Yeah.
Right? And to be able to create a growth mindset. And I think the shift, whether it's as a parent, as a leader in the workplace, to be able to say, okay, my job is not to protect people from anything bad ever happening. My role is to equip them for how to grow and capitalize and see that challenge as an opportunity when it does. Right. And so
Mm,
I want to be building into them that mindset, that growth mindset that says, okay, so here's a challenge, and that challenge is an opportunity. What are the skills that I need? What are the mindsets that I need? How am I going to overcome this, rather than how do I avoid it altogether and be protected and isolated so that nothing bad ever happens?
okay. One more question. I hope I haven't worn you out. In
Not at
thinking
all.
about lessons from living, things you have learned from life, what rises to the top for you as being most important or most significant?
For me, it all comes back to intimacy with God.
Hmm,
It's it's that's the single most important thing, right? He is going to give me wisdom for every single challenge I face. He's going to give me the grace that I need to be able to overcome those things, to walk through those things. He's going to be my comfort and my peace and my joy, no matter what I'm facing. And so because he's that source of peace and joy and hope, and because he's God and he deserves it and there's nothing good apart from him, like it all comes back to that. And if we're really thinking about, lessons from living in this life, knowing that everything we're doing here is unto the next, then we're essentially always living for eternity and living for that smile on his face that we get to enjoy forever. That's what it all comes back to.
Mm, amen. Well, how might folks get in touch with you, April, if they want to know more about these topics or what you're doing? And can you tell us about what you're doing and what services you might have available?
Sure, I would be happy to. I I think the easiest way to get a hold of me would be to go to draprilspeaks.com. And there on the website, you'll have a place to learn a little bit more about leadership injury and ways that we can interact. That obviously, some of that is just kind of education and helping people understand what leadership injury is and how to navigate it, whether that is recovering, whether that is, okay, I have an injured team member on my team. I have somebody, I inherited a leadership injury. It was caused before I even came in or before they got to me. How do I clean up a mess I didn't make? And then that other piece that we've really keyed in on of like, how do I be a leader that pulls out the best in others? How do I be the kind of leader that creates that buffer that's going to protect people even when they're no longer under my
Hmm.
my leadership? They have something that they're walking away with that's going to pay dividends. And so I do that for organizations through keynotes, through workshops, things of that nature. There's also the Leadership Injury Project, which is an opportunity for us to have a one-on-one conversation. And so my contact information is on the website, the draprilspeaks.com. And so there's a place where you can complete a form there. You'll find my email or my phone number there. And so that Leadership Injury Project is really an opportunity to have a consultation in the course of an interview, right? It's a chance to tell your story about a leadership injury that you've experienced, to ascertain, like, where am I in that healing process? Which of those 5 steps that we talked about have I done? What step or steps would be next for me? And then also a chance just to ask questions and say, like, okay, how do I navigate this challenge, whether it's one that I'm facing personally or one that somebody on my team is facing. And then there's also that opportunity to reflect and share not just the toxic leadership stories, but also, like, by the way, what have I experienced that was great leadership, that was restorative, that was redemptive, that said, oh wow, that inspires me and that's the kind of leader I want to be. That project is really designed largely as a qualitative research effort so that we can kind of pool all of these stories together and learn from each other and learn not just from what's not working, but learn from what is working and
Mhm.
develop that model of that restorative leadership, that healthy leadership that we aspire to.
Oh, that's
So,
great.
and
I
there's no
love
cost to
that.
participate in that. By the way, you basically you do an interview and you get a free consultation. So there's an invitation to do that if you want to explore that. Then just reach out.
That's amazing. Thank you. I'm so grateful to you for your time. I have pages of notes. I've been writing while you've been talking. So I have just found it personally so valuable. And I know my listeners will as well. And I, I especially appreciate how everything you talk about is interwoven with God and God's love. And that is so particularly meaningful. And I think it will really touch a lot of hearts. So I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me, Beth. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and to get to share this message and to get to share. Ultimately, the aim here is to share God's heart and make the planet a better place by having more people expressing God's heart through their leadership.
Thanks again, April, for being with us today. Your wisdom will help so many people, and I am very grateful for you. As we exit, I want to remind everyone to share this episode because I really do think it will make a difference in people's lives. So share it with friends and family. And I will leave you with the words of Robin Williams. Oh, he's such a great. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always. Go out and make it a great day.